Good morning and happy Friday. I'm John Silvis, the Fairport Wealth Chief Investment Officer. I'm joining you today out of Cleveland, Ohio. But I also want to welcome our teammates and clients out of our offices in Buffalo Grove, in Chicago, Illinois, and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Today's special webinar with Steve Pavlik is in addition to our regularly scheduled programming. I'd like to restate that your advisors at Fairport Wealth are in frequent contact with myself and the Fairport investment team. And here are some of the ways that you can also receive our content. First would be to expect to receive timely Fairport perspective updates and company newsletters via email. Second would be to subscribe to our Fairport Flash podcast on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, or Google Play. And last would be follow our hashtag Investing with Fairport on LinkedIn for weekly thoughts from myself and the team on markets and the economy. Before we get started, a couple quick housekeeping items. Everybody will be muted for the call and your cameras will be disabled. If you have any questions, you can type them into the questions section of the toolbar and we'll answer those as many as we can at the end, time permitting. So I don't know about everybody else, but here in Ohio, we're getting bombarded with TV commercials for the Senate race and some on the other races, rep, governor. I'm sure in Ohio, Pennsylvania, you're seeing the same thing. I'm excited. I'm a junkie. I love to watch the poll numbers and approval ratings and all those things. So I thought it was a great time to have someone come in who's a subject matter expert on it and give us their opinions. So with that, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Steve Pavlik, who is a partner and head of policy at Renaissance Macro Research. Steve helps firms like Fairport identify opportunities and price the political, legislative, and regulatory risk in today's dynamic environment. Steve has appeared on Bloomberg Television and Yahoo Finance to discuss current political and policy issues. He has also been quoted in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Barron's, and Market Watch, as well as the South China Morning Post. He's a former Treasury Deputy Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs. That's a long title, Steve. Former economic lead for the presidential transition team, as well as a former lobbyist and Senate staffer. We won't hold those against you, though. He's also a graduate of Georgetown University in the Darden School of Business. He currently resides in Potomac, Maryland, with his wife, Rachel. So with that, Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Well, thank you, John. And I just quick thank you, everybody, for the opportunity. And there's an old joke that the longer your title is in Washington, the less important you are. So we'll see about that. But maybe we can go to the next chart, hop into the presentation here. So when we think about the midterm electorate, you're really talking about who's motivated. Now, historically, in midterm elections, the electorate tends to be a little smaller, tends to be a little older, tends to be a little whiter, and tend to have college-educated voters. Usually the political party in power, that being defined as who controls the White House, they tend to underperform. The theory is that, the folks out of power tend to be more motivated to vote. However, when we'll get into this a little bit later, when we look at the polls, it looks like this year is shaping up where both sides are very motivated. The other thing to keep in mind too is we're starting to see some shifting demographics. We've seen Democrats make gains with college-educated, specifically white voters over the last couple elections. And we've also seen Republicans make some gains with Latino voters, which could be potentially consequential when we talk about states like Arizona, which are competitive gubernatorial and Senate contests. How older voters will decide this year is something to keep an eye on. Personally, I know that they seem to be impacted more by inflation when you think about their cost of living and retirement. If we go to the next chart, please. Sorry, it should say generic ballot, but that is a question that simply asks voters, which party are you more likely to support? And we've seen some significant change here. So in June of 21, Democrats actually had a 7% lead in an average. And then November of last year, you actually saw Republicans overtake them and sort of had a peak lead of about 4% in February. Now we sort of have both parties more or less even at 44%, which sort of makes sense. The closer you get to the election, you have this coming home effect where again, people that may not have been maybe as energized last year sort of start thinking more about the election. And if you just think about how polarized of a country we live in, that 44% seems about right. Now, the question is what's going to happen with that sort of remaining 12%? You have three options. You can go for one of the two political parties, or you can stay home. The other thing to keep in mind, too, with the generic ballot, it's not always as predictive as maybe some people think. First of all, it's a national poll, so it doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to have the same carryover effect into certain states and districts. And averages tend to be better because you're supposed to reduce some of the bias. But if we actually go to the next chart, 538 has sort of a ratings here of different pollsters, and you could sort of see just by their calculations sort of the bias as well as the grades that they assign. So if you have a average full of sort of one party leaning polls, you might not get the necessarily most predictive results. If we can go to the next chart. And then just sort of a history there that 538 did, sort of looking at midterm elections there, we can sort of see some of the trends, and maybe the next chart after that. The other thing to keep an eye on too is presidential approval. Now that tends to be correlated more with the House than the Senate. Sort of touched on this at the beginning, but midterm elections tend to be more of a referendum on the sitting president. Another thing that I thought was interesting was that the Cook Political Report sort of looked at some analysis that showed typically Democrats sort of have a ceiling of about 5% above the approval rating of a sitting president. Now that's important because you see Biden more or less around 43% in the 538 and Real Clear Politics averages. So if Democratic candidates sort of run into that ceiling of about 48%, that could limit their prospects moving forward. We did see Biden's approval rating in the Gallup poll, which tends to be one of the more reliable ones, reach a high for this year at 44%. That was prior to this week's inflation report. But just in terms of keeping things in context, according to Gallup, the average loss of seats in the House is 37, with presidents who have approval ratings below 50%. If we go to the next chart. And then we sort of alluded to this, but a question of polling reliability. Now, polls are important because they impact turnout. If you don't think your candidate has a chance to win, you're less likely to come out and vote. They also impact money and fundraising. And we've seen just over the last few elections, I would say 16, 18, and 20. Now, two of those are presidential, but we've had an issue with polling bias, specifically going in direction of Democrats. And that could be for a variety of reasons. Some question the motivation of the firms. Some, question whether or not they're capturing some of these changing demographics we talked about. Trump has an appeal to more of these low propensity voters. If you were sort of reaching out to suburban voters that you thought were Republicans but now are trending Democrat, that could alter your outcomes. I know in 2020, one thing pollers suggested was because they were calling people at home, Democrats were more likely to be at home because of the COVID pandemic. So we shall see. And I guess another sort of thing going back to President Trump, an excuse I've heard is that Republicans are less likely now to participate in polls. But we've already seen a report out by New York Times pollster Nate Cohen, not to be confused with 538 poster Nate Silver, suggesting that he sees a lot of the similar polling biases in the same areas as concern. So again, see right now what you're seeing, sort of take with a grain of salt. If we go to the next chart. Ticket splitting. This is usually associated more with the presidential races, the idea being that people are less likely to vote for a candidate of a different party for president and then pick somebody else for the Senate contest or the gubernatorial race. And I think it's just part of this theme. We always sort of hear in the news this growing nationalization and polarization of politics. I think this year we have a number of seats with competitive gubernatorial and Senate races. We'll touch a bit more on this too, but this decision on abortions now making that decided by the states could be a factor as well. And you sort of see, I know we have John mentioned Ohio and Pennsylvania. You all are probably very aware of your competitive races there. But if you look at the case for Ohio, for example, you have a gubernatorial, you have an incumbent governor there in Mike DeWine, who is pretty popular, and I think that is starting to help maybe benefit the Senate candidate for Republicans, J.D. Vance, because you start to see his approval rating coming up, maybe because, again, some of these voters are coming home to the Republican Party. Now, it works the other way, too. In Wisconsin, they have an incumbent governor and as well as a Democratic Senate candidate. So The governor's race seems to be close, with the governor slightly ahead there, and maybe that's could potentially help the Democratic Senate candidate there. So we shall see. If we go to the next chart. In the House, all 435 voting members are up. You need 218 for a majority. Now, Democrats currently have a 221 to 214 majority when you sort of factor in some of the vacancies there and which party they were originally is. Now, depending on what year you start your history from, I'll just use 538 for the example. Again, the average loss in the president's party is 26 seats. We mentioned the Gallup correlation. And so I think that's why, we'll get to the consensus view, it just seems very likely that Republicans will be able to get at least a majority. As to how many seats they'll pick up sort of remains to be seen. Now, one reason maybe for caution is keep in mind that Republicans picked up 11 House seats in 2020. And that can go back to what we were just discussing in terms of the reliability and accuracy of the polls, which predicted that Republicans would actually lose 15 to 20 seats at the time, and Democrats had a large lead on the generic ballot. But another way to think about it too is Republicans captured a lot of the low-hanging fruit. So how many of those sort of competitive races are actually in play this time could be a smaller number compared to those 25 and 30 that we've seen in the past. Now, that said, Republicans were able to make some gains in terms of drawing additional seats through redistricting. However, that effort seemed to be more focused on sort of making red districts redder to make them less competitive moving forward. In terms of what this means moving sort of beyond 22, the margin's important. Not only is it going to determine, whether who's going to be the next speaker. Kevin McCarthy will have a difficult time if he has a smaller majority. But also in terms of Democratic prospects for 2024, if they can sort of keep Republican gains into maybe the low teens, then there's a chance that maybe the House could be in play again in 2024. If Republicans were to go on and pick up something closer to maybe the 20s or even 30s in terms of House seats, it may be less of a factor there. Sorry, it looks like we go back to a few charts. If we skip ahead, there we go, to the, okay, we'll go to the Senate one maybe. Keep going. There's redistricting. That's fine. This is perfect. So now we think of the Senate. Currently split 50-50. Obviously, the tie goes to the president's party, where the vice president can cast tie-breaking votes. You see this time, much more favorable map, at least in terms of number of contests up, to Democrats. Republicans have to defend more seats. The other thing that Democrats, I think, have going for them is incumbent races tend to be easier to defend. There's been some question raised by Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell over Republican candidate quality concerns. There have been several Republicans that have won Senate primaries that don't have prior experience with elected office. Some view that as a positive for a variety of reasons. Some also point out that there's no record to attack, but we'll see how they're able to, the positions they took in the primary, whether that's going to hurt them in terms of maybe having a broader appeal for the general elected. You sort of see the key races here identified. But the other thing to keep in mind too is 2024. That is a much more favorable map for Republicans. You see Democrats having more than twice as many seats up, several in states that Trump either won or narrowly lost, and sort of reverting back to that conversation we saw too, or that we had earlier in terms of this ticket splitting theme. If a Republican candidate goes on to win the presidency, he could potentially, or she, have a potentially very large Senate majority to work with. We talk about, what might legislative options could be on the table. That would open a lot more. But again, just to highlight, you see that chart up at the top. This correlation in terms of midterms and Senate seats, isn't always as strong. So I just want to reiterate that point. If we go to the next chart. So these are sort of the formatting got off there, but this sort of gives you a sense from his current ratings before I had to hit the road this week. But as of September 12th, I doubt they've changed that much. You sort of see where the Real Clear Politics has the average of competitive Senate seats, as well as the gubernatorial races, and then the 538 probability sort of associated with those. So just wanted to make sure I flagged those. If we go to the next chart. So in terms of issues, the economy is rated by most in polls as the top issue. In terms of Biden's approval rating, there still very much underwater. I think we were reminded of inflation, probably not the way that the administration was hoping for on Tuesday when we saw the CPI report. And when you look at a poll from The Economist, most voters tend to say, now economists may not agree, but in terms of the actual poll, they say that price is the most important indicator when thinking about the economy. You have the administration often pointing to jobs numbers and employment. I think that's probably more meaningful if you are without a job versus something like inflation, which impacts everybody, and it's always in the same negative direction. Now, the White House had a narrative, and they keep highlighting too that gas prices have been coming down, I think from $5 in June, now sort of $3.50 to 70 cents, depending on where you live. But they have some things working against that. We saw that in the CPI report as well. LNG costs are rising. Part of that's the situation in Ukraine, relying more on U.S. exports. That's raising prices here. If we have a cold winter, people can notice their electricity bills and the like start to increase, their heating costs, and then also groceries. That was something that came through loud and clear in the CPI report. So in terms of just overall discretionary spending, you have a lot of these factors maybe working against what's been coming down in terms of gasoline prices. And for the Biden administration, it's just a difficult message to try to, tell people, convince people that a slowing economy is a sign of progress. And going back to this whole transitory definition, I just don't know that they've always been able to maybe get beyond that in terms of credibility there. If we go to the next chart. Abortion is an issue that's come up since the Dobbs decision in June, returning to the states the ability to decide what rules and restrictions they want to put in place. Typically, it looks like blue states would take measures to expand access, whereas red states are maybe looking at restricting some access. But Democrats have been motivated by this in recent elections. There was a Kansas ballot initiative, the way it was worded, sort of caught people, I think, a little bit off guard just in terms of how much of a motivating factor this might be. Keep in mind, many of these elections and even that Kansas ballot occurred very close to the decision. Will this still remain an important motivator for Democrats as we get into November? It remains to be seen, but it looks like in terms of what they are responding with in terms of polls, they're using that right now to indicate at least a desire for that being their priority. Whether that is a priority for other voters, going back to the undecided question, or independents, sort of remains to be seen. Again, you have this issue sort of breaking both ways too with respect to abortion compared with something like inflation, which impacts everybody, in that negative view. If we go to the next chart. The student loan decision is something that I think politically was interesting. To me, it was sort of odd timing to announce this before the election. You didn't really need to do that. So I was sort of wondering whether the Biden administration might be betting on a conservative-leaning Supreme Court to maybe strike the decision down. Anger tends to be a more powerful motivator. Some people thought maybe that they were trying to motivate younger voters, tend to be more supportive of Democrats to come out and vote. They thought, well, maybe they would give them some incentive by relieving their debt. And then some people thought, well, maybe if you promise them this and the Supreme Court takes it away, they'll be angry and even more likely to vote. I don't know that we're ever going to know the full answer there, but that's something that I've heard, at least in DC. But keep in mind too, the decision, while it may be popular with some younger voters and those with student debt, it is not popular for those that base their decision on where to go to school on how much it costs, those who honored their debt, or those who didn't go to college and are now subsidizing education for those who did. I think that's one of the reasons that you've seen Democrats remain divided on it. I know in Ohio that Tim Ryan, the Senate candidate there, was not necessarily in favor of this. Going back to this economic message, I think Biden saw his approval rating pick up a little bit on the issue of the economy when he sort of passed the Inflation Reduction Act. When you sort of say that you're going to go ahead and apply some of those savings to reducing the deficit, but then you announce something like this, it's going to add a lot to that. That may be undermining his credibility there. Go to the next chart. And then Donald Trump, I think you've seen probably an effort by Democrats here to make the election more of a choice rather than a referendum on Biden. We talked about historically, while that doesn't usually bode well for the president's party, and they've had some issues here that sort of keep Trump elevated, and some negative headlines between both the January 6th hearing as well as the FBI raid of the Mar-a-Lago home. For Republicans, if you think of sort of a seesaw, it's trying to find, I assume, that sweet spot where you are hoping that you can get those lower propensity Trump voters to come out and support you. You don't want to alienate them, but you also want to appeal, again, for more of those undecided, potentially suburban voters. So it's sort of a difficult position. The other thing, just having Trump in the news, puts Republicans, I think, a little bit of a disadvantage in terms of they are now being asked to comment on him in actions that he may be taking or things that he's saying, more than using that time to criticize the Biden administration or focus on the economy and some of the concerns there. I think moving forward, and maybe we'll talk about this in another slide, but I think Biden's sort of whole case for re-election is sort of predicated on Trump being the Republican nominee. If we go to the next chart. So I mentioned this before, but in terms of the consensus view, in terms of what's been coming out here, it looks like maybe a split decision with Democrats retaining control of the Senate, either just through a current 50-50 split or potentially gaining a seat or two, but it looks more than likely that Republicans will take the House. I thought it was notable that predicted, it was similar view for one-party control between either Republicans or House in terms of Congress. That number's tilted up a little bit for Republicans, down for Democrats. And just in terms of, going back to how to think about this generic ballot, according to the University of Virginia Center for Politics, they estimate sort of a 1% generic ballot lead for Democrats, which I think it was last week, sort of they are anticipating that would be a 1-seat gain in the Senate and 15 Republican seats gained in the House. We go to the next chart. So let's think about the impact here of what this means in terms of the economy moving forward. So one party control, we talked about probably not the likely outcomes, but still some things that are definitely possible. But if Republicans win the House and the Senate, that is going to kill the Biden legislative agenda. There'd be a question of how Biden would choose to react. You had two modern Democratic presidents that have sort of taken opposite approaches. If you go back to Bill Clinton, after Republicans made large gains in 1994, he pursued a policy of triangulation, where he tried to sort of put himself politically in between Republicans and Democrats, work with Republicans on certain areas, versus Obama, which was more of a modern day view. I think he referred to the shellacking of the 63 House seats they lost and the number of Senate seats they lost during the 2010 midterms. He chose to sort of double down, not work with Republicans, and go into campaign mode. I suspect Biden would be the latter, given he served under Obama, as do many of the people in his administration. Keep in mind that Republicans can overplay their hand too. They did this in '98, made Bill Clinton a sympathetic figure, and actually during Clinton's second midterm, Democrats defied history and actually performed better and were able to make some gains there. The other scenario for one-party control is what we're currently living with, and that's Democrats retaining control of both the House and Senate. Now, that means the possibility for legislation still exists. And it's going to be important to see whether or not Democrats in this environment or under this scenario actually gain 2 additional Senate seats, because then there's going to be a question of will they remove the filibuster. The other thing to keep in mind too is as we start thinking about entering a recession next year, if the Fed is trying to raise rates to deal with that, are they going to encounter fiscal support coming from a Democratic Congress? That could make their, ability to fight a recession very difficult. If you have the Fed sort of raising rates at the same time, Democrats are adding additional fiscal stimulus. That means you'd have to actually add rates potentially much more significantly. So it sounds like an interesting economic white paper. I don't know if we necessarily want to live through that, but I think that's a legitimate concern. If we go to the next chart. Divided government, again, talked about that's the most likely scenario. Even if Republicans win the House, you sort of take this threat of legislative risk off the table. That's why traditionally markets have preferred divided government, not necessarily on the politics, just more of the idea that you're going to go ahead and be assured of what that operating environment is going to look like moving forward. It's not all great, though. It does increase the odds of government shutdown risk, as well as potential debt limit defaults. In terms of how administration pivots to that when they sort of lose the ability to move legislation. So your whole goal is to deliver on your campaign promises, and that means relying more on the agencies and departments to follow through on executive actions. And I think if you have a Democratic Senate, that will be able to continue to populate people and reappoint folks to those agencies and departments to do that. If Republicans were to win the Senate, they have less an incentive to confirm Biden nominees because they don't want these agencies and departments to follow through on these things. Anybody who will win Republican support is going to have to likely be more moderate, and that means those policies would potentially be more moderate coming out of there. So if we go to the next chart, regardless, there are going to be some international challenges that I just want to flag for people in the Congress and the White House will have to deal with regardless. When you think about a global recession, that might put the U.S. in a position of relative strength. What does that mean for a stronger dollar? A lot of economic implications. Think of indebted countries that have dollar-denominated debt. More difficult for them to pay that off. We're going to have President Xi Jinping likely receive sort of a norm-breaking third term here as the president there in China. He's 70 years old. They mentioned that because this whole threat of invading Taiwan, I think, is likely to remain a while. Xi has said this is something he wants to pursue during his lifetime under his rule. I mentioned he's 70, so we sort of see maybe a smaller runway there for when that possibility could occur. There's also, the question of Ukraine being aware of this and how are they responding. We're having this debate right now in the Senate, actually providing Taiwan with more arms. And so I think, this idea, this porcupine strategy, where Taiwan wants to actually get as many, fortify itself through weapons purchases and capabilities and the like to make it very difficult for Xi Jinping and Beijing to go ahead and execute that quick invasion. I think that's one of the lessons they may have learned from the Ukraine situation. On the more positive news, I do think once Xi has secured that third term, there's hope that he might have the political cover at that point to at least relax the zero COVID strategy that is causing slowdowns in terms of economic growth, and also I think really impacting the price of oil at this point. With respect to Ukraine, Zelensky has this winter warning of, what it's like if they aren't able to wrap the conflict up by then. We've seen Ukraine reportedly make some gains there. Recently, there's some question of can this coalition remain unified if we get to the winter and things aren't resolved. My guess is that's sort of what Zelensky and Ukraine are pushing for right now, is try to force Putin to the negotiating table to reach a more favorable settlement. Don't know if that's going to happen. And then beyond that, sort of thinking of this broader theme of friendshoring and nearshoring. I haven't seen many companies necessarily, pulling out of existing locations, but clearly you have the U.S. and others looking to make a more attractive environment to incentivize companies and the like to, build new facilities, ideally in the U.S., but if not there, in trusted, partners, whether it's Mexico, Europe, and the like. You also have sort of an autocratic alternative with China, Russia, Iran, Korea moving closer. So that's going to put some companies, as well as some countries, in a difficult position of having to choose. Another theme to watch, sort of related to all this, is just this availability of supplies for this renewable energy transition. You have a lot of countries, the U.S., Europe, looking to pursue this again, transition to renewable forms of energy. The availability of those materials is there's just not enough to go around. And what does that mean moving forward in terms of that bridge? Does it get extended, rely more on fossil fuels? Do we see more of a shifting focus here in Africa and the like, where some of the cobalt, lithium are available, and tensions there as well? So if we go to the next chart, want to flag just the Federal Reserve. Biden appointed 5, although one was a Trump reappointment. So you have now Democrats with 4 of the 7 Federal Reserve Board folks. Now, again, it's 12 voting members, but keep in mind, and just in terms of the board, you have more dovish replacements. And you think about the dual mandate between stable prices and employment. If you look at statements made by Lisa Cook, Philip Jefferson, emphasizing employment diversity figures, I think there's clearly more of an emphasis there. So when we get to some of these marginal decisions, will the Fed remain committed to get to 2%, or will 4% become the new 2%? That's something to watch for moving forward. If we go to the next chart. So the midterm election is Tuesday, November 8th, which means the unofficial kickoff to the 2024 presidential election is Wednesday, November 9th. I think just partisanship and recent history would suggest another close election. At the 2016 election, 78,000 votes decided it in 3 states. It was about 45,000 in 2020. And just sort of this symbiotic relationship between Trump and Biden. I think Trump views Biden as a relatively weak candidate, somebody he thinks he could defeat. There are some polls that he would point to that show that that's why he feels confident in doing that. And conversely, I think Biden doesn't always have the affirmative case for a second term, but I think one of the reasons he was able to capture the nomination, eventually the presidency in 2020, is he sort of made the argument that Trump is an existential threat. I'm the one who was best equipped to beat him. You can't take a chance. Look what happened in 2016. It's not clear to me who would replace him. But when you think about the midterms and what they mean for 2024, if Democrats have a relatively good night, I think that makes it more inclined that, Biden will make the case, you're better off sticking with me. Again, assuming Trump is the nominee. Similarly, if Republicans do well and a lot of Trump's backed candidates go on to perform, maybe he has a better argument to say, my message is resonating. This was a choice election and the voters choose me. So stick with me in 2024. If we go to the next chart. So again, I mentioned the timeline starting. The question a lot, when do people actually declare? Usually that's about the spring. And if last time is any indication of this time, the first primary debates are actually going to start in June. I know it's hard to think about, and Republicans are definitely going to have a presidential primary. It's not clear yet whether Democrats will or not. If you think about this sort of crowded field, I bring that up is both Trump and Biden benefited that from previous elections. Trump sort of had this plurality of voters. A lot of candidates in 2016 typically divided up the vote. Trump was able to sort of win, create a lot of momentum. Similar in some respects to Biden, had a lot of people more in the progressive lane, again, dividing up that vote. Biden was able to keep that plurality and eventually was able to go on and capture the nominations. One thing to factor in too is Democrats are going to reorder the states that take part in their presidential process in terms of their primary. So it's not going to be Iowa. They have not yet announced what the order is going to be, but that's really important in terms of who is going to be well positioned to go on and win the nomination there. And I think that may have been the last chart. Yep, the disclaimer usually is the fancy way for the end. So hope that was somewhat interesting.
No, I definitely think it was, Steve. I appreciate it. If you have any questions, now's the time. You can put them into the chat function on the toolbar. I have a couple questions for you. So,
sure.
If there is one bellwether race out there you're looking at, kind of would tell you, you're watching Tuesday night and you're watching the elections, and this one breaks one way or the other. Is there one out there that you could probably put a finger on? I know you had a conversation with Crystal Ball a couple of days ago, and they threw a few out there. I just kind of want your thoughts were.
I guess it's tough for me to pick one. I guess when I sort of think of the states that I'm keeping an eye on for different reasons, Pennsylvania comes to mind. If Republicans can go on and pick that seat up, I think that's a good indication that they're going to overperform that night. Another one, too, that might actually be sort of somewhat correlated to Nevada and Arizona. We talked about maybe these shifting demographics for Republicans, particularly amongst Latino voters who are making up more of a greater percentage there of the electorate in both those states. If that trend holds and they are able to win one, there's a good chance they may end up picking both. And if you win that, you are definitely talking about a Republican Senate majority at that point.
So you talked a lot about the Fed, or a few moments about the Fed. You talked about inflation, president's approval rating. How about the markets? Do the markets have any indication on the outcome? I know you said it's kind of a referendum on the sitting president. We've had a market here, which for the most part of this year has been, down around 15–20%. I think people are getting their statements on 401ks. Does that play as much as inflation does, or what they're paying at the pump?
Well, in terms of again, I'll break it down into two things. I think market reaction prefers divided government, again, sort of removing the legislative risk, but in terms of how much does stock performance play into the election, I think it goes into the broader inflation sort of narrative where, am I better off today than I was 2 years ago? People just sort of not feeling as wealthy. Going back to just retired voters, older voters tend to vote in large numbers, and they've watched their retirement savings erode and their cost of living as a result of this. I can't help but think that's going to motivate a lot of them. And as a father now, I start thinking about my 529 plan for my son. That's not performing as well. I assume I'm not the only one who's concerned about that. So, we talk about, I think what's difficult to grasp, you sort of have to think about not only each district and each state, but almost each individual, what are going to be those motivating factors, the prioritization of things. Because we have, we talked about inflation, we talked about abortion, we talked about the stock market, Trump and student loans. I mean, different people are going to weigh those things differently. And I think that's sort of where this becomes a little harder to handicap. And one thing that Professor Sabato said that clearly I hadn't really thought about, but it sort of made sense after he said it, is, you had prior to this, Trump and Obama were two pretty polarizing presidents, for both sides, obviously, because that's the definition of a polarization. But, he sort of made this comment, and I'll try to be nicer about it than he was, but, Biden is not as motivating. He's not as polarizing, of a person. So that may put more of the emphasis there on those issues, as opposed to just more of some natural adverse reaction to getting people's, motivated to actually come up there and vote. So.
Yeah. Well, I just know from the previous administration, President Trump would always tout the stock market, and Biden's much more like the traditional president where they don't really comment on market movements. But
well, in fact, recently he said, that's just one economic metric, and he sort of downplayed the significance of that. Now, I don't know if that's just to the point to draw the contrast with Trump, something that Biden always tries to do, or, because the market's not performing better, that he might not try to draw attention to it. I mean, recall that, he was not encouraging us to look at gas prices with respect to inflation, saying focus more on the core CPI. And then the most recent report, it was the exact opposite. It was, hey, emphasis on declining gas prices and don't worry about core CPI, which more than doubled, I think, what economists were expecting. So,
yeah, I have said many times now that a year ago I used to watch the number of COVID cases. That was what I watched every day. Now I watch gasoline prices every day. So it just kind of tells you where we're at, and I guess in the process. But we did get one question. You touched a little bit on this, but maybe you can reiterate it. How important is the political makeup of the Fed?
Because I'm the political policy guy, my view may be a little different from our economist view. I think it's pretty significant. I think in terms of, we sort of touched on this, just having more of those dovish tendencies, more of the, you look at who's been promoted to the board now, emphasis on employment. To me, that suggests less emphasis as a result on the price stability aspect. You've seen Elizabeth Warren and others sort of already positioning themselves for this, and to blame Powell as the boogeyman, and sort of, make the point that the economy doesn't need this pain that he's suggesting, that it should really be the emphasis more on the employment numbers beyond just the remit of the Fed. I think it's more the desired expanding remit of the Fed. We start talking about digital currencies, this idea of maybe climate finance, putting restrictions on banks lending to fossil fuels. That is something where I think clearly there's desire amongst Democrats in the Biden administration to do that. And that sort of goes back to what we touched on, just the inability to pass legislation. So you have to rely more on these agencies and departments to sort of achieve your goals there. And I think now that the Fed is fully staffed at the board level, and look at the people who came in, I think that wouldn't surprise me if that sort of is where maybe they're headed. Although, some would point out, given inflation, you've been tasked with two things, you can't even do those right. Why would you be trying to pursue additional tasks as well? But
so I guess last question of mine would be, is there a good chance we won't know the outcome on Tuesday night? A couple Senate seats are probably pretty close, at least for the makeup of the Senate. Because I know it seems like in 10, 20 years ago, you go to bed knowing who won. Now with the early voting and absentee balloting, and I know last election cycle with the mail-in balloting being such a big part of the COVID response, it took days, which I think kind of feeds into the uncertainty of everybody, and the population gets a little nervous because everybody wants to jump out in front of, well, I won, I didn't win. Do you think we'll see something like that again, or you think this will be more normal process?
I think the definition normal is starting to shift. But I think more to your point, I mean, even look at 2018, even if you want to consider 2020 an outlier, the initial reports suggested that Republicans were doing well, but as more seats were sort of called down the road and ballot recounts and the like, Democrats actually had a pretty good outcome, at least in the House. Republicans actually gained 2 Senate seats. People forget that, but Democrats, I think, gained 40, 41 House seats. I suspect we are going to see something similar in that we might not know the outcome potentially for several days. Some of these races are as close as maybe people are anticipating. The one caveat to that would be if we sort of see some October surprise, or maybe some indication here, now that the generic ballot's tight, to start breaking one way or the other. And traditionally, that's happened. It doesn't usually remain this close in the midterms heading in. We see sort of one party starting to pull away, and if that's the case, maybe it'll just be a question of the margin rather than the outcome. Is it going to be 52, 53 seats in the Senate, for a night that looks pretty good for one party or the other. But again, on the House, I sort of just, for a lot of reasons, I think it's just a question of how many, what's the margin of the Republican victory there.
Yeah, great. Well, listen, Steve, I really appreciate it, and I thank you very much. For anybody out there, if you had a question and you weren't able to ask it for whatever reason, feel free to reach out to your advisor, and we'll try to get an answer to you as quickly as we can. I want to also thank our marketing group for helping set this up. Annika and Kristen, appreciate all your help on these things. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It's our privilege to inspire you and your family, and feel free. We feel sincere gratitude for your trust and loyalty in us, and stay safe and stay well out there. Thank you very much. Again, thank you, Steve. Appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Bye-bye.